Hello and welcome to the next edition of the HP Discover podcast series. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host and moderator for this ongoing discussion on IT innovation and how it's making an impact on people's lives. Our next DevOps thought leadership discussion explores the concept of continuous processes around the development and deployment of applications and systems. Put the word continuous in front of many things, and we help define DevOps. Continuous delivery, continuous testing, continuous assessment, and there's more. Here to help better understand the continuous nature of DevOps, we're joined by two guests, James Governor, founder and principal analyst at RedMonk, and Ashish Kuthiala, Senior Director of Marketing and Strategy for HP DevOps. Welcome to you both.
Hi. Hi, glad to be here, Dana.
Ashish, let's start with you. We hear a lot about feedback loops in DevOps between production and development, test, and production. Why is the word continuous now cropping up? What do we need to do differently in IT in order to compress those feedback loops and make them impactful?
Absolutely. So, a two-part question, right? The word continuous, why is it popping up in this new model of software delivery? I think gone are the days where, you would see the next version 3.0 coming out in 6 months and, 3.1 coming out 3 months after that. If you use some of the modern applications today, you never see Facebook 2.0 is coming out tomorrow or, Google 3.1 is being released. They're continuously and always making improvements, from the back end onto the platforms of the users without the users even realizing, that they're getting better improvements, better user experience, etc. So I think in order to achieve that, you have to continuously be building those new innovations into your product. And of course, you need to, as soon as you change something, test it and roll it all the way to production. So we, in fact, joke a lot about, everything's continuous, so why don't we just drop the word continuous and just call it, planning, testing, development like we do today, right? And just say, you continuously do this. But we tend to keep using this word, adverb, continuous before everything. I think a lot of it is to just drive home the point across the teams in, these organizations that you can no longer do this in chunks of 3, 6, 9 months. You always have to keep doing this. So that's the.
How do you do the continuous assessment of your continuous marketing?
I always we joke about continuous marketing of everything. So the continuous assessment term, in spite of my objections to the word continuous all the time, is a term that we've been talking about at HP. And the idea here is, look, most software development teams and production teams, when they start to collaborate well, they take, the user experience and the bugs and what's not working on the production end at the user's, hands, what the software is being used, and feed those, bugs and the user experience back into development teams. And when many, companies actually get to that stage, it's a significant improvement, right? It's not the support teams telling you that, 5 users were screaming at us today about this feature or that feature, but it's the idea that, you start to have this feedback directly from the user's hands. I think we should stretch this, assessment piece a little further. So why assess the application or the software when it's at the end, the hands of the end users? The developer, the enterprise architects, the planners design an application, and they know best how it should function. So, whether it's monitoring tools or whether it's, the health and availability of the application, start to shift left this, as we call it. And I'd like to, James to kind of comment more about this because he knows a lot about the development space. The developer knows his code best. Let him experience what the user is starting to experience.
Well, yeah, I think my favorite example of this, as an analyst, you're always looking for those kind of nice metaphors and ways to talk about the world. And certainly one notion of quality I was very taken with. I was reading some history about the shipbuilding industry and the roles and responsibilities involved in building a ship. And one of the things they found, of course, is that if you have a separate team doing the riveting from doing the QA on the riveting, the results are not as good because someone will happily just go along, rivet, 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 rivet. I don't really care if I'm doing a great job. Somebody else is going to have to worry about the quality. And as they move forward with this, they realized that you needed to have the person doing the riveting doing the QA. And I think that's sort of a powerful notion of how things have changed. And certainly the notion of shifting left, doing more testing, in this continuous sense, more testing earlier in the process, whether that be, in terms of integration, whether it's load testing, whatever it is, just all the testing needs to happen up front, and it needs to be something that the developers are doing. I think the new suite of tools we've got makes it easier for developers to have better experiences around that, so we should take advantage. I think one of the other things about continuous, obviously, is, we're making reference to manufacturing modes and models, and, lean manufacturing is something that led to fewer defects, well, apart from one catastrophic example to the contrary. And we're kind of looking at that and saying, well, how can we learn from that? So lean manufacturing, that ties into lean startups, which ties into lean and continuous assessment. And what's interesting is I think now we're beginning to see some interplay between the two. We're sort of paying that forward, because if you look at GM, they just announced a team explicitly looking at Twitter to find user complaints very, very early in the process. So rather than waiting until you had 10,000 people that were affected before you did the recall, because last year was the worst year ever for recalls in American car manufacturing, which is interesting because if we've got continuous improvement and everything, why did that happen? They're actually using social tooling to try and identify early so that they can say, well, let's recall 100 cars or 1,000 cars rather than 50,000. So I think that it's that just monitoring really early in the process, testing really early in the process, and most importantly, garnering user feedback really early in the process. And so if GM can improve and we can improve, yes.
Yeah, I do remember it was in the late 80s when the Japanese car makers were really kicking the pants of Detroit that we started to hear a lot about simultaneous engineering. You wouldn't just design something, you would design for its manufacturability at the same time. So it's another concept. But going back to the software process, Ashish, we see, of course, a level of functionality in software that needs to be rigorous, security, performance. But we also are seeing more and more the need for that user experience for features and functions that we can't really even guess at, that we need to put into place in the field and see what happens. So how does an enterprise get to that point where they can so rapidly do software that they're willing to take a chance and put something out into the field, perhaps a mobile app, and learn from its actual behavior? We can get the data, but we have to change our processes before we can utilize it.
Absolutely. Let me be a little provocative here, but I think it's a well-known fact that the era of the 3-year-old forward-looking roadmaps is gone. Right? I just can't imagine. It's good to have a vision where you're headed, but what feature, function, and which month we will release that the users will find useful, I think that's just gone. With this concept of the minimum viable product, or MVP, that most startups take off with and try to build a product and fund themselves as they gain success, I think it's an approach even bigger enterprises need to take. You do not know what the end user's tastes are. Let's just take our examples here. I changed my taste on the applications that I use, the user experience I get, the features, functionality. I'm always looking at different products, and I switch my mind quite often. But if I like something and they're continuously giving me, there we go, the word continuous again. But if they're always delivering the right user experience for me, I stick with them. And I think the way for an enterprise to kind of figure out what to build next is to capture this experience, whether it's through social media channels, whether it's actually engineering your code so that you can figure out what the user behavior actually is. I just don't think that the days of business planning and developers sitting in cubicles and thinking this is the coolest thing I'm going to invent and roll it out is going to work anymore. I think you definitely need that for innovation, but you need to test that fairly quickly. I also use the word, gone are the days of rolling back something when something doesn't work. If something doesn't work, if you can deliver software really quickly at the hands of end users, you just roll forward, right? You don't roll back anymore. So it could be a feature that's buggy, go and fix it, because you can fix it in 2 days or 2 hours versus the 3 to 6 month cycle. You release a feature and you see most users, 80% of the users don't even bother about it. Turn it off, right? Introduce a new feature that you're thinking about. And this assessment, from the development, testing, production that you're always doing starts to actually benefit you, because when you're actually standing up for that daily sprint and wondering what are the 3 features I'm going to work for as a team, whether it's the 2 things that your CEO told you have to absolutely do it because I think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, or it's the developer saying, I think we should build this feature, or these use cases coming out of the business analysts or enterprise architects, now you have data, right? You have data across all these teams. You can start to make smarter decisions, and you can choose what to build and not build. To me, that's the value of continuous assessment, right? You can invest your $100 for that day in the two things you want to do. None of us have unlimited budgets.
All right, for organizations that grok this, that say, yeah, I want continuous delivery, I want continuous assessment, what do you need to put in place to actually execute on it to make it happen?
Well, I'd say that we've spoken a lot about cultural change, and so that's going to be important. I think one of the things, frankly, as an underpinning, if we're talking about data and being data-driven, is just that we've got wonderful new platforms that enable us to store a lot more data than we could before at a reasonable cost. We've come out of a period where, I mean, I think there were many business problems we've seen that were basically stymied by the fact that, frankly, you'd have to spend the GDP of a country in order to do the kind of processing that you wanted to truly understand how something was working. So if we're going to model experiences, if we're going to collect all this data, I'd say some of thinking about what's your actual infrastructure for that so that you can analyze the data is going to be super important. There's no point talking about being data-driven if you don't have an architecture for delivering on that.
Ashish, how about loosely integrated capabilities across these domains? Test, build, requirements, configuration management, and deployment. It seems that HP is really at the fulcrum of a number of these technologies. Is there a new layer or level of integration that can help accelerate this continuous assessment capability?
No, absolutely. You're right. We have a very rich portfolio across the entire software development cycle. But you've heard about our big data platform. What can it really do if you think about it? Like James kind of just referred to this. It's cheaper and easier to store data with the new technologies, whether it's structured, unstructured, video, social, etc. And you can start to make sense out of it when you put it all together. There's a lot of rich data in the planning process, the testing process, all the different life cycles. And I'll give you a simple example of a technology that we've worked in internally, where when you start to deliver software faster and you make a line of change, one line of change of code, and you want this to go out, you really can't afford to do the 20,000 tests that you think you need to do because you're not sure what's going to happen or not. We've actually had data scientists working internally in our labs, studying the patterns, looking at the data, and testing concepts such as intelligent testing. So if I change this one line of code, even before I check it in, what parts of the code is it really affecting? What functionality? It could even, if you're doing this intelligently, does it affect all the regions of the world, the demographics? What feature function does it affect? Helping you narrow down, whether it'll break the code, whether it'll, actually, affect certain features and functions of this, software application that's out there, narrowing it down and helping you say, okay, I only need to run these 50 tests and not need to go into these 10,000 tests because I need to run through this test cycle fast. Make sure, have the confidence that, it'll not break something else. But again, with, not the rollback, but the roll forward thing, you can have confidence with that. So it's a cultural thing, like James said, but the technologies are, also helping make it easier.
It's interesting. We're borrowing concepts from other domains in the past as well, just-in-time testing or fit-for-purpose testing, right? Lean testing.
Lean testing, we're talking about, lean testing at HP Discover. I won't talk about that here, in terms of product, but the idea is exactly that. The idea is, the developer, like James said, knows his code well. He can test it well before, doesn't throw it over the wall and let the other team take, a shot at it. It's his responsibility. If he writes a line of code, he should be responsible for the, quality of it.
And it also seems that the integration across this continuum can really be the currency of analysis. When we have data and information made available, that's what binds these processes together, and we're starting to elevate and abstract that analysis up, and it makes it into a continuum rather than a waterfall or a handoff type of process. Before we close out, any other continuous words, words that we should put in front of continuous as we get closer to DevOps? Continuous security, perhaps.
Yeah, security is a very important topic, and we've talked about it a lot, between James and me and some other thought leaders here. Security is just like testing, right? Anything that you catch early on in the process is a lot easier and cheaper to fix than you catch it at the hands of the end users, where now it's deployed to tens and thousands of different people. So security has to be, it's a cultural shift in a little bit. I mean, the technology has always been there. There's a lot of technology, within HP and outside of HP. You need to incorporate the security testing and, the discipline right into the development and planning process and not leave it towards the end. In terms of, another continuous word, I mean, I can come up with continuous Dana Gardner podcasts.
Yeah, there you go.
Continuous discussions about DevOps, perhaps, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that RedMonk is very interested in, and is really our view on the world, is that increasingly developers are making the choices, and then we're going to kind of find ways to support the choices they're making. And it was very interesting to me that certainly the term continuous integration began as a developer term. And then the next wave of that, we began to talk about continuous deployment. I think that's quite scary for a lot of organizations. They'd sort of looked at that, whoa, what are these developers talking about? Continuous deployment, how's that going to work? I think that sort of the circle was squared when, I had somebody that was coming and they just began to say, well, actually, what we're talking to customers about is continuous improvement. Which of course is a term again that that we saw in manufacturing and so on. But I think the developer aesthetic is tremendously influential here, and this change has been driven by them. So I guess I don't know. I think my favorite continuous is a great phrase: continuous partial attention, which is the world we all live in now.
Well, very good. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. We've been exploring the concept of continuous processes around development and deployment of applications. I'd like to thank our guests. We've been here with James Governor, founder and principal analyst at RedMonk. Thank you so much, James.
Thank you.
And we've been joined by Ashish Kuthiala, Senior Director of Marketing and Strategy for HP DevOps. Thank you, Ashish.
Thank you, Dana.
I'd also like to thank our audience for joining this special DevOps thought leadership discussion. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host for this ongoing series of HP-sponsored discussions. Thanks again for listening, and come back next time.